presentation is from Bob Grover. And Bob is going to talk to us about the past, the history of the current club. He's going to talk about a little bit about what we're doing now, and then a discussion about where we're going. I think I emailed all of you his handout. He's got it for you here today. So hopefully you had a chance to kind of contemplate maybe some of those questions there at the end that will come up. And of course, I'm sure, I hope all of you have known Bob long enough to know that he is retired from the School of Library Science, Dean of the School of Library Science here. He continues to hold the status of Professor Emeritus. Emeritus, sorry. You never know. As here. we do. That's of course is Bob is the reason that I'm here with this group. With the passing of my father, he was kind enough to invite me to join him. So, and I think he's going to talk a little bit about joining. So,
yes, and we're going to have a discussion toward the end about the future of our organization, and I want to record it, and I'm trying to get this going here.
We'll have this recording also.
Okay. What I want to do is when we have a discussion, I'll use the recording to perhaps some minutes, because we want to talk about the future considerations for this organization. So we're going to have a brief history, and one of the things I discovered.
one more thing, I apologize. There is copy back there. Right.
Was that in the early days, much of the history was lost. But I did find some other interesting sources, including a 1949 Gazette article that I'll be referring to. So there's going to be a brief history, and talk about, I found some information about some of the founding members, which is quite interesting. And then we'll go over some of the original rules, because they might influence what we decide on for the future. And then helping with the recent history, I asked George and Rod, George Melton and Rod Sobieski, to reflect on their experiences, and wasn't expecting a person who from 1971 to be here. So Scott has the longest experience, I think, of anyone. When did you join, George?
Whatever he convinced me to get in.
Okay, there you go. There you go. Okay, so after we go through some of the history, then George and Ron are going to do some updating, and you can do some updating too, and we can all join in. And then after the recent history, we'll discuss about the future, changes that we should consider, and if we're going to continue, how can we gain new members? That's part of it too, plus other ideas. So that's an overview. I'm having trouble with my voice. So if you have trouble hearing me, my classroom voice has left me. Since I've been retired for 15 years, you can understand how that goes. So let me know, raise your hand if you can't hear me, but I'll try to project. Well, as you may know, Current Club was organized November 14th, 1900, at the home of Albert R. Taylor, and the call for the first meeting was signed by Taylor, F.G. Ward, W.A. White. It was sent to the first members of the club and a few others. And on the handout is a listing of the founding members and the first officers. And I want to go through, I was able to find some information on some of the founders. I wanted to share my findings with you. And the original rules, we'll talk about those a bit too. So the signers of the call for the first meeting, were asked by the other men at the meeting to draft a set of rules for the club and also to furnish the papers for the first 3 meetings. And at the second meeting, held at the home of William Allen White, the name Current Club was adopted. Actually, Current Club of Emporia, Kansas. The rules were ratified and the first officers of the club elected, and William Allen White was elected the club's first president. And the founding members are on the handout. And I'm going to go through a few of them to give you some information about them. Among the founding members, Joseph Henry Hill, who lived 1858 to 1927, was Kansas State Normal School's 7th president. Hill was the first president to graduate from Kansas State Normal, and he became the next president of the Normal School in 1906. He followed Jasper N. Wilkinson, another member of the club, when he resigned. And during Hill's administration, several new buildings were constructed on campus. I can't tell you which ones, but on June 30th, 1913, Hill resigned, and he became a professor at Boston University. Now, a couple of other members, we know the names, I don't know very much about them. A.S. Newman and F.C. Newman, probably forebearers of the now closed department store here and the Newman Health Organization, possibly. I don't know for sure because I couldn't find it. Another founder was Frederick J. Saulberg. He was associated, well, he was the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church here, one of the founders. Lyman B. Kellogg, well, we're a familiar name for us at Emporia State. He was the first faculty member and the first president of the Kansas State Normal School. He was born on September 28, 1841 in Lorain County, Ohio, and he was selected to head KSN after graduating from Illinois State Normal in 1864. Albert R. Taylor. In 1882, Taylor succeeded Rudolph B. Welch as the 5th president of Kansas State Normal. And 2 years after becoming president, Taylor upgraded the school from a 2-year institution to a 4-year. Taylor decided that in order for enrollment to grow, he would reimburse students who traveled more than 100 miles to attend the school. Taylor is quite an innovator. Taylor resigned on June 6, 1901 to become president of Millikan University in Decatur, Illinois. Jasper Newton Wilkinson moved to Emporia in 1884 to become a professor at the Normal School and later became vice president. And Wilkinson took over as the Kansas State Normal School's 6th president in 1901, following Albert R. Taylor's resignation. Shortly after becoming president, Wilkinson decided that students who were failing would not continue at the Normal School, and only those who completed the 4-year program would graduate. And in 1901, the school's first men's basketball team was played in Emporia. I'll throw that in since I'm from Indiana and basketball is so big. In 1903, a library opened along with the new bleachers for the football fields in 1905. And after resigning in June 1906 from the Normal School, Wilkinson bought and became president of the Citizens Bank in Oklahoma. L.A. Lowther, another name that we're familiar with. Many of us know Jim Lowther was a state representative. I couldn't find anything about L.A. Lowther in my search. And the same with C.B. Graves, probably forebearer of Graves Pharmacy, I would guess. Frank C. Ward, though I was able to find some information on. And in 1899, Frank Ward began his pastorate of the First Congregational Church in Emporia. He served almost 7 years and later went on to join the faculty of Chicago Theological Seminary. Mr. Ward presented the first paper for this organization, the Tsar's Peace Treaty in the light of recent events. Current events from the very beginning about the Tsar. We've come a long way. John Calvin Miller, who lived 1899 to 1905, he was president those years. became third president of the College of Emporia. So someone, one of the few who were represented from the College of Emporia. Edwin William Wilbur Cunningham was a justice of the Kansas Supreme Court from 1901 to 1905. And Major C. Hood came to Emporia in 1872 and was engaged in the cattle trade. And he was a director and vice president of the Emporia and Kansas City Railroad. Quite a successful businessman, one of the founders. And William Allen White, well, I have more about him. He was first president of our club. He was born in 1868 in Emporia. White grew up in El Dorado and attended the College of Emporia and later the University of Kansas, but he didn't get degrees from either one. And though the future sage of Emporia attended both colleges, didn't get a degree, and in later years, White would earn honorary degrees from at least 8 leading universities. That was interesting what he wrote about his future. In 1885, White wrote, "Sheer luck put me into the newspaper business." While a student, White sent 3 letters asking for a job. One to a grocer, one to a college merchant, and the third to the editor of the El Dorado paper. Bingo. White got the newspaper job in El Dorado, where he learned the printing and newspaper business. And White later became a reporter in Lawrence, and in 1892 went to work for the Kansas City Star as an editorial writer. In 1895, he borrowed $3,000 to purchase the Emporia Gazette. $3,000. In 1896, White wrote a sarcastic editorial. You probably heard of this. "What's the matter with Kansas?" And there was an editorial that was written in haste and in anger after White engaged in a street corner debate with a local populace while waiting on a train for a trip to Colorado. Well, it made him famous, and he hadn't really intended that at all. After McKinley's election in 1896, White made many national contacts that kept him in touch with leaders and current affairs. He also was called on to aid in drafting the Republican national platforms. In 1936, White worked for the presidential nomination of Alf Landon, fellow Kansan, who was defeated, as you know, by Franklin D. Roosevelt. And that year, White also was chairman of the Republican Party's Resolution Committee. White wrote more than 24 books, including biographies, fiction, nonfiction, and an autobiography and poetry. And he died on January 29th, 1944, here in Emporia. Now, the first officers, I think they're listed here on your handout. The original rules and regulations of the current club, I picked out some of them for the handout. I don't have all of them there. But the maximum membership, as you can see, shall be 25. And it goes on to say that provided that no person invited to the meeting or organization shall be excluded from membership if he subscribes to this agreement before the close of this calendar year. And another maxim was if a member of the club shall be absent for 3 consecutive meetings without sending a written excuse to the secretary for the same, his membership shall be forfeited. And they say his, because we'll get that later. Whenever the membership shall fall below 25, and you see that right here, any member may nominate a candidate for the vacancy. And all elections for membership shall be by ballot at the meeting next succeeding the nomination. And to elect a candidate must receive a majority vote of all members of the club. And the annual dues shall be $1, such a deal, payable in advance. And the meetings of the association will be held at the homes of members. And I think many of you remember when you met at the homes of members. In fact, when I first joined in the 80s, or in the 90s, later than that even, it was in the houses too. So it was only recently that we left houses. The office of the club shall be, I mention this because we have to consider if we want to continue doing this. President, vice president, secretary, treasurer, and an executive committee of 3 members, one of whom shall be the president. The officers shall be elected by ballot at the last meeting of the club in April of each year. Again, we want to continue that, and shall serve for 1 year. And the duties of the first 4 officers' names shall be the same as those usually pertaining to such officials, secretary, treasurer, president, and so on. The secretary shall notify the members of the date and place of each meeting at least 3 days before it occurs. It's a good practice. And you also see on the list, the program for each meeting shall consist of formal paper, we still do that, informal contributions, and formal paper shall not exceed 20 minutes in length. And in the notes that I found, that often wasn't paid attention to, just as it was long. In the case, the club shall at any time decide to entertain a distinguished guest or to give a dinner, the expense shall be borne by those voting for or participating in the same. A majority of the members of the club shall constitute a quorum for the transition of business. And so on. What you see on this paper, I think the most significant items from the early Constitution. Now, the first year calendar, I wanted to call your attention a few of the meeting themes. Featured papers on current topics are represented here at the very beginning. The very first meeting of the current club, where they had them, a paper, was November 27th, this date, 1900. And the title was The Czar's Peace Treaty in the Light of Recent Events by Frank C. Ward. And then on December 11th, William Allen White gave the paper. And it was entitled Croker. Didn't mean anything to me. Maybe if you're a historian, you know something about it, but it was a paper about Richard Wellstead Croker, who lived from 1843 to 1922, known as Boss Croker. He was an Irish-American political boss who was a leader of New York City's Tammany Hall. So we'll talk about that was current at that time. And another, that first year, was a paper by Jasper N. Wilkinson entitled Good Roads. Again, current topic. One more, was a paper about the first year by Charles B. Graves entitled Difficulties in the Enforcement of the Law. Even then. Then and in succeeding years, current topics were presented as papers for discussion. According to my calculations, I am presenting this history as about the 977th paper for the current club. And I figured that 7 papers were presented the first year and 8 in succeeding years. Now, I'm sure that varied some, and some days it didn't happen, some years it didn't happen. But I'll claim 977. And we'll see who wants to do 978. An article in the Emporia Daily Gazette, published in December of 1948, noted that early records of current club were lost. However, the original rules limited the papers, as we heard, to 20 minutes. And although this Gazette article noted that some essayists became so interested in their topics, they somewhat lose their sense of timing. The papers would reportedly average 30 minutes in length, and during early years, the meetings began promptly at 8:00 p.m. An average meeting attendance was 21 at the 50-year mark, and they stopped at 10 o'clock. And the 1948 Gazette article notes the current club at that time was a men's club. And although the evening's host often involved his wife in preparation of the refreshments, and at an annual meeting, whatever that meant and whatever that was, wives were guests. And as you know, in recent years, women have become members Welcome, Betsy. About 1940, the club added a discussion leader to the program. The duty of the discussion leader was to start the discussion, and the leader had the privilege of talking longer than the others. So we have to be careful about who that discussion leader is. Sometimes the meeting was open for a free-for-all discussion, but usually the discussion was formal with each member taking his turn. In the early years, the club passed around hard candies and apples to members as refreshments. Well, we've come a long way from that. But a few years into the history, refreshments were expanded to, and I quote, "a variety of good things to eat and drink spread out on the table." And wives often assisted with preparation of the refreshments, undoubtedly to add to the quality. And according to the 1948 Gazette article, the club often had guest speakers that included well-known physicians, authors from out of town, politicians, and leaders at state and national levels. One notable speaker was the former director of the Kansas City Philharmonic, and it stood out to me. Members of other men's study clubs were invited to attend as guests. William Allen White was a speaker annually. Now, this was interesting, relating his various trips around the world or glimpses into his new books. One such program was excerpts from the book A Very Rich Man. Another time discussed his new book, Woodrow Wilson. Another program was his report on the Institute of Pacific Relations, which he attended in Honolulu. Early in the club's history, members for 10 years could join the life membership. So we have some candidates here. Continue that. You could 2 memberships at least, 5 memberships. Let's see. Members for 10 years could join the life membership and escape being host. They didn't have to present papers, and they didn't have to pay dues, even though they were $1. So
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah.
back then, yeah, it was probably $5 to $10 today. Yeah. Well, so for an updating, I asked Ron and George to kind of give us their remembrances. And I asked them to, first of all, when did you join the club? Who were a few of the more memorable members at that time? And more recently, and how has the club changed? And Ron got here first, so I asked him to go first, and then George will speak too. So Ron, over to you.
Okay, a couple things. I would have to, some of you don't know, but when I was walking in with Mike, I asked him if Scott Irwin was going to zoom in to tell me, because Scott, among other things, was a member when I joined in the early 80s. And he also organized at the country club the 100th anniversary, which we had a fancy dinner and, you know, imbibements and things like that. So Scott probably should be doing what I'm doing right now. Just in case. Anyway, so how has things changed? Well, again, when I first joined, you met at someone's home, and that ultimately, and I don't recall the reasoning, but it evolved to meeting in this very room when Gordon Bechtel was the minister here. And that was a different change, because it eliminated getting your house ready and asking your significant other to help you with the refreshments and things like that. And so some of the names that I recall, one of the things today is more of an ESU club. But back then, I think it was definitely a mix, almost more town as opposed to gown. So some of the people that I remember are people like George Crocker, who George was a member of this group, and George, I happen to know, was a major refinisher of the painting in the Granada Theater that they were renovating it. I mean, so he was an artist and all those kinds of things. And interestingly, I met George at a group I attended for a short time called the Outlook Group. The Outlook Group was a mixture of community people and a few of us. And I asked George one time why he stopped going. And to show you the change that didn't appear to me to occur, but he complained vehemently that it became more of an argumentative group instead of anyway, and it never did make sense, but and by the way, I got out of Outlook because it was even more archaic than the rules on it. For example, first meeting, somebody's taking notes. And I raised my hand and I says, why doesn't the speaker just give a copy of the paper? And it would, they voted on it and it lost. Anyway, I did present a couple times there and it dropped out. And again, there were only, I could only think of two other people. One was Carl Prophet that was in it with me. And when Brett Thomas first came there, Carl invited him for a while. Anyway, so besides George, or Gordon Bechtel, I already mentioned, there was an America's teacher who I can't think his name right now. He was an elementary school teacher, was a regular member, and I can't think of his name. Posey, the former superintendent of the school district, was there. Ray Call, major Gazette editorial. A couple of insurance agents to show you a mix of people, and I can't think of their names now. And John Peterson, who we all know. And another long-term member was Jack Melhorn. He was there very, very much so. And this discussion we're going to have about our continuation, this is probably the 5th or 6th time I have been involved with this group about what we're going to do and how we're going to get members. So this is a long-term issue in which we've been, and I have recruited people myself, I think.
Look at me.
And anyway, other ideas, I don't have any more ideas. The group has changed radically. And in fact, I even looked at our contact information from a couple of years ago. And if half of the people on this sheet were to attend again, we would have a good turnout. And my question is, why aren't they? And anyway, Scott, I would ask you to make a comment if you would.
Over long-term, it was, there were a lot of things about it. I've got the impression from some of the history that I presented at that 100th anniversary that I found in some of the history. The organization was somewhat more formal. I have no intention of drawing a judgment on whether that's good, bad, or vanilla. It was just somewhat more formal. I was invited, is the word. I was invited in when a year after finishing graduate degree at University of Texas at Austin in 1970, and took a position at Emporia State in 1971. And at that time, there was a membership list, and there were categories. The categories were, among other things, the leaders, the officers, the membership. I don't remember anybody. There were a few years when we might have pushed that 25 member limit. Somewhat larger attendance than it's been probably the last 20. how someone, that just the steps of how someone got to be a member back, even in 71, it was still this way. Originally, and I think you mentioned this one, the officers were the ones who usually invited someone that they thought might be interested. And then there was a step in there where they didn't come to that guest or guests didn't come to the next month's meeting, because one of the items on the agenda, and there were for the most part through the years, there were only a few formal reading of the minutes of the last meeting, and here's what was decided, and so on and so forth. And a lot of those were at the last meeting. One of our members invited such and such person to attend. And then it was understood and explained to that person when they were first invited. So they wouldn't, what did I do? What did I say? Nothing like that. But there was a vote. And as I remember right, if there were just two objections, this is interesting. If there were just two objections for that individual being compatible with the history of current club, they were not invited back. I have never found anything, and I've gone through. Oh, and this is another difference, and I don't even know when this stopped happening, but the secretary, who was an active officer at that time, wrote a brief summary of the presentation of each meeting. And that was submitted to and announced, just like so many other groups, not just in Emporia, but lots of places. But a brief explanation was given of what the presentation was about, and so on and so forth, and that the next meeting would be so-and-so. And yet it was a somewhat exclusive organization. And so I guess that was the Gazette's attempt to be helpful, and probably the members' attempt to maybe maintain some interest in other people inquiring about it. I don't remember any history of any member or any person who was invited to not. Oh, one other rule that helps make this decision. I don't know that anyone was ever dismissed from the membership. There was a category, and maybe this is one of the other categories was, and I'm sorry, I don't remember its label, but after you had been a very regular, solid someone who presented when, depending on the number of members, every so often you were a presenter, and so on and so forth. But when you had been in an active role for 10 years, you had the option of being, it's got to be somewhere, of a master member. I think that's what it was. I think it was a master member, which meant, if you're retired from your career, your main professional career, and spend the winter in Florida or Arizona or whatever, you're not gonna, because a hardcore rule that apparently was enforced to some extent was 2 consecutive absences that were not explained, unexplained absences, was put that member at risk of not being invited to continue. I've gone through in really getting ready for that 100th year when I remember that not only what did the secretary get a report for decades, that showed up in the Gazette. So I went back as far as the Gazette itself and the Emporia Public Library records published some of those, as well as other related items. One that I don't think was ever in the bylaws but somehow evolved was that members who were presenting, scheduled to present. Somehow it evolved that they were challenged to do some legitimate research that was not closely related to their careers. In other words, stretch yourself a little, so to speak. And because in the early 70s, when I was invited as a guest in 71, and then 2 months later was told, well, you squeezed through. And that was still a very active trend, even if it wasn't in the bylaws. People were strongly encouraged to present something that wasn't just what they did in the committee meeting the week before or something like that. I've said enough.
When I joined, that was sort of the operational direction, supposed to go outside the community. And interestingly, I know there was no vote in the early 80s, that had gone away. But something that Bob mentioned in his introduction, in this room, when we were in this room back then, and we were having a discussion about our future, I mentioned inviting ladies, women to the group. And I was shocked. It was shut down. It was not, even John Peterson was negative. I was surprised. Yes, indeed. It's something I remember.
Okay, so I've got to ask, who was the first woman?
I think I was trying to think of that. It may have been June Underwood. I'm not sure. Okay, who ultimately, I think she was in the library at that time. I guess.
I will speak to that. As near as I remember, and I don't want it to be interpreted as anything defensive, but the sense that the membership seemed to have was there were two, and again, my memory's really slipping on a lot of things, but there were two very active women's study groups in the community, at least two.
Yes.
And in fact, they were much more faithful and regular of having a summary in the minutes of their meetings in the Gazette. They were still doing that. And I don't know that was, I never got the impression that was some kind of defensive reaction that the current club members had. And so let's make this up, because it was already going on once a month. Those summaries from the women's groups.
Thank you, Ron. George, what are your thoughts?
That guy got me here. I think it's something like, you should do this. I never figured that out. What should I do? But the idea of presenting material that was outside of my realm of expertise intrigued me, although I haven't done it. And the idea of getting together with other people outside of the schoolyard, if you will, was also the main driving force for me, because if I am fortunate enough to be in an educational setting and hearing only those people talk, I should expand myself and hear other people talk. That's my view of it, which I'm very fortunate that I have been able to do that.